I'm David Barber. I'm a distinguished scientist at UiPath, and my role is largely to do algorithm development. So that is to create the next generation of tools and techniques that people at UiPath can use that eventually will filter through to the products. The progress of generative AI to date, I think, is absolutely amazing. If you think maybe only 5 years ago what we could do then, we could make maybe very small scale clunky images which didn't look that great. Now you can generate 2-minute long videos, which is very, very impressive. Similarly with text, we now have incredible systems that you can ask questions and you get these amazing answers. These machines seem to know a huge amount of incredible information. You can get access to that. So in general, I'm very, very impressed. So one of the biggest limitations of generative AI right now is the so-called hallucination problem. So that is, if you ask these models a question, sometimes it will generate a totally wrong answer. And actually what's even worse is that you don't know that the machine has got it wrong, right? In the sense that the machine doesn't tell you necessarily that it's got the wrong answer. So the machines don't give you directly a sense of the confidence in their responses. So sometimes you ask a question and they confidently, or they just give an answer and you have no idea if it's right or wrong. So that's something that we need to work on, and we are working on it, and we're trying to control for those issues, but that's certainly inherently a limitation and a challenge around generative AI right now. Another problem or challenge, I would say, is the time that these systems take to respond. That can be in the order of 1 or 2 seconds. So if you ask a query to something like a large language model and it takes a couple of seconds or so to generate the response, well, that may be okay in some situations, but if you're in a large volume situation, have lots and lots of queries to deal with, or that response is part of a much larger, a component of a much longer system, then that actually can really be an issue. So the speed of the execution and the response is something else that we want to improve. And also the cost, right? I mean, these things take energy. It's actually relatively very expensive to run a query on a large language model. So reducing the time and reducing the cost is also very important. So solving some of these current generative AI challenges is going to require a combination of skills, actually. So there are people working, for example, on how to improve the fundamental underlying technology around these generative AI systems. So for example, the hallucinations problem is a very challenging thing to address because the fundamental way that these models work doesn't automatically lend itself to actually solving that problem. So we're working on new ways to think about how these models can answer questions in a much more reliable way. So that might involve, for example, using other kinds of systems, and it's likely that the large language model will maybe call other systems when it needs extra help. So that's one thing that we're working on. There are other kinds of things. So for example, we're trying to reduce the time and the memory complexity of these models by using algorithmic improvements. So one of the interesting things about these models is you can ask a question and then get a response, but the size of that question is also limited. The longer that question gets, the more difficult and expensive it is to get an answer. So for example, if you said, well, here's a book, or say a financial report, could you put that into the question and then ask the machine to generate the answer? Well, you might be able to, depending on how big the memory is, but it'd be very expensive and very time consuming to get that answer. So working on ways which can reduce the time and the cost in order such that we can actually put into the memory the question much longer documents and much more complicated questions is also fundamentally important. Well, generative AI is changing all the time. It's almost every day some new bombshell result comes out. So it's hard to to know where we're going in the future, but I think there are some fairly clear indications of the near future. So we're going to likely see improvements in multimodality. So currently, we typically use these systems, we might use them just for text or, for example, just to generate an image. But in the future, in the near future, we're going to see much more integration of these different modalities. So, for example, you might have a system that can generate both text and a video. You might also be able to talk to these systems. They might understand what you're saying. They might even understand the expression behind your facial movements, right? So they may understand some of the nuances in human communication. And that all would feed into a much more dynamic and a much more richer interaction with these kinds of machines. So I think the near future is that we'll see much better modality, much richer human interaction.